Black and White, an unrehearsed discussion of problems in progress in race relations in the United States. Your moderator, the noted lawyer, political scientist, and television personality, Max Kampelman.
The problem of race and color is not one that affects the United States alone, but in this country, it is one of our most critical problems. The United States prides itself on being the oldest functioning democracy in the world. The use of the word democracy obviously means a government based on human equality, a society which does not discriminate on the basis of color or religion. But the relationships between the white and the Negroes in the United States, between the white and the black, is one that is still very far from the ideal demanded of it by the requirements of a democratic society. Dr. Gunnar Myrdal, the distinguished Swedish sociologist, once described this relationship between the races as the American dilemma. We know what ought to be. There ought to be equality. But we also know that we have still not reached where we ought to be. This troubles the conscience of America and is therefore a subject that is constantly written about and talked about. We have with us today 4 nationally known specialists in the problem of American race relations. We've asked them to come here and to analyze this problem in a frank and open manner. These are men who have worked in the field of civil rights almost all of their adult lives. They are Dr. Samuel Cook, professor of political science at Duke University and one of America's outstanding political scientists; Mr. Julius Hobson, an economist, an author, and an active fighter against discrimination and segregation; Mr. James Farmer, Assistant Secretary of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, a man who for many years was the head of one of this country's most active civil rights organizations, CORE, and an eloquent spokesman for freedom; and Mr. Hyman Bookbinder, known in Washington as an expediter of social causes, a man with a distinguished career in the American labor movement, a former deputy to the director of the United States Anti-Poverty Program. We will start this discussion by asking Dr. Cook briefly to give us his views on whether we in the United States are making any progress in the field of race relations. Sam, can you summarize the state of the civil rights movement as you see it?
Well, I'll do my best. I think, first of all, we've got to make try to find some perspective. I think we have gone from an age of hope to an age of despair. I think, for example, that from, say, the mid-50s until the mid-60s, that was an age of hope, an age of tremendous progress. That's the period in which we got the civil rights legislation, administrative changes, period of great cooperation between black and white. I think, Max, really, this was one of the most creative periods, not only in American history, but in Western history, the history of Western culture. Fantastically creative period, morally and humanistically speaking. But I think starting with the mid-60s, we entered the age of despair, or the decade of despair. Now, there's a relationship between the age of hope and the age of despair. One of the reasons for the age of despair was precisely the progress made during the age of hope. This is the paradox. Progress is self-feeding. The more you make, the more you want to make. The black man's aspirations were escalated. He became more impatient. And, of course, white resistance increased. And I think these two strains created the age of despair.
Well, how do you gentlemen like this age of hope and age of despair combination?
I think the expression is a good one. I wonder, were you suggesting that starting with the mid-60s or early 60s, there was no more progress, that the progress ended in the early 60s?
No, I'm not suggesting that. I'm saying, though, that the desire for progress, the demand, by far exceeded or outstripped the accomplishments.
Oh, well,
so that was a tension created.
I would accept that formulation.
Jim?
Max, yes, I'd like to ask Sam if he would evaluate the progress that was made in that decade of the 50s. Was it significant? Did it change the life condition of the average black person in the country?
Well, there's some doubt about that. Of course, the progress was not uniform. Surely in the South, for example, the most brutish laws against humanity, segregation laws, were wiped out. I think there was progress in terms of the symbols of humanity to begin with. America, for the first time, really recognized, I think, the dimension of the problem, the desire for blacks for equality as human beings as well as as citizens and so forth. Now, you're right, in terms of the average black man, the civil rights legislation was not very effective. But I think even so, the average black man received some of the benefits as a symbol of his humanity. And this to me is important.
Well, don't you think, Sam, that in the United States it's traditional to measure progress in terms, and actually in physical terms? You know, what happened to black median family income over that period? It actually declined.
Well, did it actually decline during that period?
Yes, it did. Black median family income went from about 64% of white median family income in 1960 down to about less than 50% today.
I beg to differ with you on that.
Also,
I'm going to give you just a minute.
I think that also there's a problem of the rate of unemployment among black youth in the United States between the ages of 16 and 25 over that period of time, which is very high. In fact, it increased during the most intense poverty years in this country. So using American standards of measurement, I think it would be pretty hard in economic terms to talk about progress.
Well, Julius, why don't you keep talking for a moment and tell us now how you see this? Are you saying that the age of hope really wasn't an age of hope?
Well, I think it was an age of hope. I think that hope springs eternal in the human breast, but I don't, I'm quite not as full of despair about what happened to the civil rights movement as Dr. Cook is. I think that really what happened was that from 1960, when the activists started, the black man became visible in the United States. I remember as a boy and as a college student prior to World War II that a black man was invisible. Ralph Ellison's title, The Invisible Man, was apropos. But I think the civil rights movement did make us visible, and the vogue is black this year. And I think that we are in a different stage of the revolution at this point in time. I just don't think, I think we overestimated the effectiveness of our tools in the civil rights movement in the first place. We shall overcome nonviolence were not adequate tools to deal with the social problems which we face. Now we've moved to another phase of the problem.
Well, you've raised a lot of questions,
yes.
But let me, before we get to the second point, Hi, you were going to take issue with some facts.
Yes, there's a lot of confusion about what in fact has happened to the economic status of the Negro people in America.
I'm not confused about it.
Well, there is confusion. It's confusion right now between us because I just happen to have with me the figures of the Department of Commerce and Labor joint figures, which tell me, and they have not been contradicted anywhere, that the median income of white and Negro families, when you compare them, in 1959, the percentage of Negro compared to the white income was 61%. In other words, the average Negro family had an income which was equivalent to 61% of the average white. That went up from 1959 to 1967 to 68%, an increase of 7%. Now, it varies in the various regions. South is not quite the same progress as some other places. Now, I don't want to be misunderstood because I want to clearly on record that I think 68% is still an abomination. But we ought to recognize that the gap has not widened, it's narrowed. But it hasn't narrowed quickly enough.
Jim has got something to say.
Comment on that. For one thing, part of the reason for what you refer to as the narrowing of the gap is the war. And we are involved in a war. And during World War I, there was a narrowing of the gap. During World War II, and the same was true to some extent in the Korean War. And it is true now in the Vietnam War. But in the period between wars, there was a tendency for the gap to widen.
I think one other observation ought to be made here. Black men were born under the same constitution as white men in the United States, and you can't think in terms of freedom, in terms of percentages. You're either free or you're not free. A ball is round or
But you used the percentages, and I think, therefore, since you used the percentages, it was relevant for I to take
Yeah, that's absolutely
with that
correct. But
last
I don't want to get carried away over these percentages because they don't measure very much in terms of freedom. You're either free in this country and you're a full citizen of the Constitution, or you're not.
Is that the only percent
That's all that counts as far as I'm concerned.
Well, I think we'd all agree here.
Yeah.
Now, Jim, did you want to make another comment? But there was one point that you said, Julius, that I'm just going to tantalize without going to it, and that is this business about maybe the nonviolence wasn't an effective tool. I don't want to drop it, but I don't want to pursue it right now. Jim, you've had an interesting career here. You've started as an activist, the head of CORE, a militant organization, a Southern freedom fighter.
Yes.
Now
Northern
you're in the
freedom fighter,
government.
too. Yes.
Now you're in the government. And do you see things any differently?
No, I don't see them any differently, Max. I felt all along that there was a need for people on the outside protesting, complaining, criticizing, pointing out what was wrong, stirring consciences, and trying to make changes from the outside. I felt also that there was just as much need for fighters on the inside who are fighting to try to come up with constructive programs, to try to battle the bureaucracy, to produce the things that we need in order to make changes. We need both a Mr. Outside and a Mr. Inside. Now, I've felt that the victories that we won during the decade of which Sam spoke have not, unfortunately, spoken to the needs of the masses of black people. I think we're able to buy the hot dog at the lunch counter now. I was down in Mississippi recently, and we checked into a fancy motel in Greenville, Mississippi. That would have been utterly impossible a few years ago. But it's largely a victory for black people of means. The poor black person couldn't check into that motel. And he couldn't care less about Howard Johnson's or Holiday Inn, the big motels and the eating places on the highways. But for the poor, there has been little improvement. Now, it's not important to say to the poor man that he is a part of a smaller percentage now than he was a few years ago. And you wouldn't say that, I know, Bookie, because I know you've been battling with us on this. But it's no good to him to say that you should cheer up, because the gap has now narrowed.
Excuse me, but what you say about the poor person who doesn't appreciate the fancy motel would be equally applicable to the poor white person, wouldn't it? It's just that, if we can use percentages again, there are more poor black people than there are poor white people.
Proportion. In proportion,
In proportion, that's what I meant.
In fact,
the reason I was hesitant, I didn't want to use the word percentage again, Joyce, if you'd get angry.
No, go ahead, percentage, fine.
Well, there are other reasons, too. If I don't want to talk too much on this. But the poor black man knows that he's also black, and he knows that racism, or racial prejudice, has not been removed in this country. We have battered down some barriers, it's true. But I do not think that we've made any significant impression upon the racist attitudes which still exist, and we must someday confront them. You know very well that the Kerner Commission report, the President's Advisory Commission on Urban Disorders, pointed to white racism as being the source of urban disorders. We have not tackled that. The man who will now sit next to you at a lunch counter and drink a cup of coffee without developing indigestion may hate you just as much. And he will still fight to oppose desegregation of the schools or oppose your child having an equal shot at life. He will still fight just as much to have you live next door to him, as the case may be, or to have a decent job.
Well, I would, if I'm in order, I'd like to just make one observation about this question of racism. I have very little concern about the attitudes of individuals, whether they like each other or not. That's really unimportant. I think that what we really got to do in terms of this racism in this country is look at it as an inherent characteristic of our system and try to find out if it isn't a necessary institution and if we aren't going to have to really cut it out. I think our political and economic system might have something to do with the fact that we seem to be maintaining this racism, which oversimplified by definition is a rationalization for economic exploitation. Now, I realize that it has now become a sociological problem and a psychological problem as part of our nervous system, but it had its origins in economics. And I think, again, as I said in the beginning, that the tools that we use to deal with it, we shall overcome nonviolence and so forth, were inadequate.
I want to comment on that. I certainly would not say that I don't care what a man thinks and whether he likes his brother or not. It seems to me this is a social and a psychological fact that we have to confront. The question is, how do we deal with it? I don't care if he likes me personally. That doesn't matter. But I think the way to deal with racism is by giving power to the powerless so that they have the capacity to impose sanctions. Now, this does not remove racism, but it checkmates it. If a man who is a bigot, who is prejudiced against me, knows that I can impose economic sanctions on him if he hurts me, or I can impose political sanctions on him if he hurts me.
Well, what about the law?
Then, all right, the law.
Yeah, Sam, before I turn to High, I want to ask you a question, if I may. You're a
I want to comment on something he said before you asked the question.
All right, you go ahead.
I differ with Julius on the meaning of racism. It isn't merely economic.
No.
And I think an economic interpretation of racism is superficial by its very nature. Economics is one of the aspects of racism. There are psychological and moral dimensions of it. And I suppose ethical dimension, really, You know, I think racism, for example, is the doctrine of man.
Well, Sam, that relates to my point. The thing I was going to ask you is, in your studies, don't you see evidences of this kind of racism or discrimination all over the world, not a particular characteristic of our economic system?
Yeah, that's true. There's no necessary relation between a particular economic system and racism. Racism undergirds a variety of economic and social systems.
Well, let's stop right at this point, and Bookie, I want to give you your...
This is a good point. Let me tell you a very personal thing, that when the Kerner report first came out and I saw the phrase white racism, I cheered. I said, at long last, somebody is telling the American people just what they ought to be told. But now looking back, I'm not at all sure that that was a useful use of those words. I think it's been counterproductive because it's come to mean, in many people's minds, that every white person is accused of racism and doesn't want to see progress, doesn't want to see an integration movement continue. So I don't think it was particularly helpful. Just behind you, Jim, there's a photograph of the 1963 March on Washington. That march was for jobs and freedom, which really sums up what we've been talking about.
Except it didn't get in.
Well, let me make this point. What we found, what we're finding now, and I never would have thought so, was that guaranteeing freedom, or taking the first steps towards freedom, difficult as that was, has turned out to be easier even than providing jobs and economic security. Because giving the full economic security means taking away from something, from somebody, something that they now have. So we found it very difficult. And Sam, you're right. I think we've made relatively less progress in the last years than we did in that decade you talked about, because we found that it's even more difficult to do than we realized. The only reason Julius, took you up on the percentage is not that I want to parade these percentages as signs of great accomplishments, but what the percentages do, what the story of some progress, little as it is, does, is to suggest that the system can produce some results. And how do we get the system to be even more productive, more effective? Because it is not true that we cannot make progress. Progress shows we can make some.
I'd like to inject in this and tie in with something Julius said before and focus on this point. One of the items that Julius raised was that the tools have to be changed, that maybe the tools were ineffective because the results weren't that effective. Now, I want to present another argument to you. I've heard it said that we did indeed make progress toward freedom because the cause for civil rights was indeed tied to the nonviolence, to the Martin Luther King ideology, to the appeal to the conscience of America. And that once that changed, and once violence began to inject itself, and once hatred began to inject itself, and once a form of black racism began to inject itself, which it did in some segments of the community, from that point on, progress may be stopped. Now, I'd like some analysis of that.
I certainly don't agree with that fully. I don't know what you mean by black racism. If you mean black people banding together to protect themselves from...
No, that's not what I mean. I mean black racism. The same as white racism.
If you're talking about the Black Power movement and the urge on the part of the Black Power movement to shape their own destinies or go to hell under their own steam, however you want to do it, instead of under the white man's steam, I think that I really don't call that racism. And I do think that the measure in this country in terms of where we are is an economic measure. I agree with Dr. Cook that this is a psychological problem, and I said so, and it's a sociological problem, and it's part of our nervous system. And I think, though, in answer to Mr. Bookbinder, that actually racism as we know it is a child of the West, the kind we have here. It was born out of slavery. It became a rationalization. Howl every night at 12 o'clock, thick cranium, small brain, and the other rationalizations which are used to keep the black man in his position in the United States at this point in time. But it's basically a profitable institution in this country, and we are profit motivated. So therefore, I am saying that it is an inherent characteristic.
Well, it's also the opposite. It's also the opposite of profit. 40 or 50 billion dollars of gross national product is wasted in this country because we practice racism.
Jim, you want to say a word, and you've got a chance.
We want to pursue a discussion of racism, fine. I think it's very complicated, and I think to an extent all of us have been conditioned by racism, whether we're white or we're black. From the very infancy, the preschool books, textbooks, and so forth have helped to spread the doctrine of racial superiority and inferiority based upon color. But I'm concerned now with the question of tools that you raised, Max. I think up until recently, the main focus of the movement was an appeal to conscience, saying something like this: we will assail your ears, America, and we will expose you to our bloodied heads and fill the jails to bursting and parade before you the corpses of our martyrs, and we hope your conscience will be moved, and moved adequately. It has not been moved. What we found is that people's consciences are moved by other things. If you're dealing with an employer on job discrimination, if he finds that you can hurt him in the pocketbook, then his conscience becomes very active. Or a politician, and he discovers that you have the capacity to keep him out of office or put him in office, then he becomes very conscientious. Now, this is what I mean by power, and what I mean by the capacity to impose economic and political sanctions. And I believe that that will checkmate racism.
But you've now moved away from violence.
Well, how can you do that in a
You've been
I
discussing
haven't talked about
violence.
violence at all.
I see.
Well, how
How
can you do that, Jim, under conditions where people are denied the opportunity to use the ballot, where a man is denied a job?
That's very simple. We're fighting for the right to use the ballot, and in Mississippi, we did get a black guy in a small town as mayor. And I was down there now, and they're talking about running men for mayors in larger towns, and they have a good chance to win. It can happen in Jackson, Mississippi very soon. You do it by getting registered and fighting legally for the right to register.
Sam, you live in the South. Now, would you want to address yourself to that or something else?
Yeah, I want to address myself to the basic issue discussed by Jim Palmer. You're right. Power is essential, as Martin Luther King emphasized. Economic power, political power, educational, all that. But it's also true that morality is itself a basic form of power. And I still think it's important to appeal to the conscience of white Americans.
Well,
this is crucial.
Of course,
I don't want to see it, the civil rights struggle, for example, cast in the form of a might versus might, in that we'll lose. I want to see it cast as Martin Luther King cast in terms of might versus right.
Well,
so I think that there must be a union, as Martin Luther King insisted, and of course, I'm a disciple of Martin Luther King. We were classmates in college, this, that, and the other. I have deep affections. You have all that you have and so forth. Yeah. But I do think that morality is a crucial source of power in the American context.
I don't suggest that we not appeal to the conscience,
yeah,
but I suggest
but
that
conscience
we add
is not
a new ingredient
sufficient.
to it. Conscience is not enough, and the conscience has not been moved adequately.
Well,
Yeah,
I think
agree.
personally that it'll take another 100 years to deal with the consciences. There are 200 million people in this country with 200 million different consciences, and I'm not in favor of dealing with them. I think my rights stop where yours begin. And I think that no matter what I think of you as an individual, if by law I am forced to respect your right as a human being and as an individual, that's all that matters. I don't think that we can go around worrying about who loves each other. People inside of families don't love each other. And it's a time-wasting process. We've had a decade of civil rights activity to prove it. As Jim said, we did not reach anybody's conscience. And I hope we don't get off on that morality kick, which I question.
Well, Jim,
anyway.
Did you say we did not reach anybody's conscience, or did you say that conscience is not enough and it has to be backed up by other power?
Conscience is not enough, and consciences were not adequately moved. I think that if we wait for consciences to be moved sufficiently to make substantive changes, we'll be waiting for the kingdom of God.
Well, why do you think?
That's a long time.
May I ask this question? We had some very significant legislation. We talked here about the importance of the ballot, didn't we, as a way of getting power. Now, why did the Congress enact the legislation which permitted the registrars to be sent down there and to help the Negroes to register? Do you think primarily they were coerced into doing this, or do you think that the appeal to conscience played an important role in it?
Oh, I think it was a combination of things, including political pressure, including the demonstrations in Birmingham, led by Dr. King, which were subsequently followed by demonstrations in city after city, because politicians, being politicians, do respond to political pressure, and this becomes a part of the conscientious reaction.
Well, Jim, I think you should take it further. I think it should be taken further to say that the international situation was such that this country could no longer afford to not deny the ballot to the black man. We had Africa emerging, we had another world, the communist world, and we had the West. And I think that it was really a question of vying for the balance of power and the international situation, the improvement in communications, which caused the Congress of the United States to pass some of the legislation which it passed. And I think it was really an international expediency which forced this.
Bookie, that's true.
May I take us back to...
You say it is true or not?
No, I said if what Julius just said is true, then how would you explain the lack of progress recently? Since you still have those same international realities, the same struggle for power in the world arena. You still have Africa, you still have Asia.
You caught me with a heavy question.
Now, so you obviously don't think it's true. What do you think is true then?
No, I think, as Jim Palmer said, a variety of factors. They could confluence of many forces. Economic forces, political forces, social and moral forces.
And the moral forces you would not ignore.
No, I would not. I would emphasize.
I was going to say,
got a chance
in the
now to say
period,
something.
in 1957, when the first and a very historic Civil Rights Act was passed, that ushered in a period of 7 or 8 years, in my judgment, that was based largely on conscience, on belief, on morality, added to the significant pressures. People were troubled when they saw Selma and they saw places like that. But this wasn't a case of a minority of people forcing their will because of direct economic threats or physical threats. I think something happened, though, in the middle 60s, and you were alluding to it earlier. What happened in the middle 60s is that we did not come through in our performance rapidly enough to guarantee meaningful civil rights. And meaningful civil rights means being able to buy that dinner in a fancy hotel once in a while. And then our patience was exhausted. The patience, certainly of black people, was exhausted. And we, I believe, unfortunately, too many Americans gave up confidence in the systems being able to accelerate that progress. I haven't personally. I think most blacks in America, every indication is that most blacks haven't given up confidence in the system either. But there are enough people in this country who feel so disappointed in our relatively slow progress in the last few years that I don't think we can be too optimistic about getting back that great coalition based upon wanting to move this country forward.
Jim, I'd like to turn to you now in a related area, if I may. You're now in government. You indeed ran for Congress last year, so that politics is something that's real to you. You just come back from the South where you've seen people running for mayors. Yes. How would you evaluate now the days ahead, and not the long range, but the immediate days ahead, as far as political progress toward civil rights?
Well, I don't like to use the term civil rights now, because by civil rights we mean those constitutional legal rights.
You want to expand those for economic?
I would expand it to human rights, yes. Human rights, economic rights, and other rights which are not included or guaranteed in the Constitution. I think we're in for tough sledding. I think we are now going to have to face some very difficult and complex problems. It's not as simple as sitting at a lunch counter demanding a cup of coffee. Now we're going to have to zero in on reorganizing the whole educational system of our country so that our kids will no longer be crippled. We're going to have to back up to Head Start, which starts before first grade, and move even earlier. I like what Israel is doing, for instance, and a prenatal program dealing with children. We have missed out on the first 5 years. If we're going to prepare our people to compete, then we're going to have a program that starts at age 0 and continues all the way through school.
Could I make an observation?
Please, Julius, yes.
I really feel that we are skirting the main issue, and the main issue is that the fountainhead of the problem of racism in the United States lies in the white community. And what black people are doing with Head Start and these finger-in-the-dike programs is reacting to white racism. And until we speak to the fact that the bankers who control the finances in this country are white, that the cops are white, that the government is primarily white, then I don't think we're speaking to the heart of the matter. Well, what we're doing is going into the black community, dealing with a black man's reaction to oppression, and having programs like Head Start, in which we take a cup of water from a polluted stream, purify it, throw it back, and command it to remain whole.
I think this is an inadequate description of Head Start, and how are you going to get those bankers from the ghetto community unless you give the kids a head start? Unless you improve the total environment.
Well, I don't know if we want to get bankers from the ghetto community. I don't know if our salvation lies in the direction of bankers. No, I was referring to the bankers in the white community who control the finances in this country. I'm referring to the white housing ring of segregation around the nation's capital.
I hope you're not suggesting that all the bankers should remain white.
No, I'm suggesting simply that the problem in this country is the fountainhead of the problem is white racism and white oppression, and not programs to deal with black reaction to white oppression.
I suggest that in this country, if we are to deal with the problem of racism, we're going to have to deal with the black community and the white community. We've got to deal with the effects of racism.
I agree with you there.
The crippling of our kids,
I agree with you.
We've got to deal with housing.
I agree with you.
We've got to get rid of the rats.
I agree.
You agree with me? Why did you disagree?
The only point that I'm trying to make is we seem to be dealing only with the black community
We're
when
dealing
you
with
talk
both.
about civil rights.
Well,
If you give me an hour to tell you what we're doing with the white community as well as the black community,
I'd like to
Julius,
hear
I
it.
will.
What are
Well,
we
the Head
doing?
Start
Tell me.
program, for
I didn't know
example.
we were doing anything
The Head
with
Start
Head Start is not exclusively black.
It's
Did
for
you
both.
realize that the majority of the kids in Head Start
Well,
are
I
white?
think as an official, elected official in the Board of Education in the District of Columbia, I'm concerned about education from 9 to 3. Not Head Start, Pre-Start, Outward Bound, and this kind of thing. I think we can deal with the question of education. Instead of incarcerating children from 9 to 3, we can educate them. And that's what we've been doing to black and white children.
I say
in
that you've
Central
got to
City
start
schools
with
in
them
this
before
country.
they go to first
So
grade.
this is what I'm
Julius,
trying to
If we're
say.
going to do anything on
Julius, let me
education.
ask you-
Excuse me a moment, dear. I want to just clarify this. It seems to me that it is true that one of your responsibilities is as a school board member, and so you're concerned about 9 to 3. But as I listen to Jim Farmer, he's concerned about what happens before 9 and after 3, and before they reach age 6 and ready to go to
I
school.
think if you do not spend any time reclaiming black youngsters and the black ghetto community, building the economy, building the educational systems, building in community control, building in self-determination, then you're missing the boat.
Well, let me ask you this, Jim. Do you know anything about the recent evaluation of Head Start?
Of course I do. I
What
read
was it? What was it?
The recent evaluation, the Westinghouse report to which you refer, said something that all of us had anticipated and expected. First of all, that there were no changes in the cognitive skills, no greater improvement. We had anticipated that because Head Start starts normally at age 3.5 to age 4. You've got to start at age 0 or prenatally. It said furthermore that there has got to be more emphasis upon follow-through. Unless you improve the quality of that education from 9 to 3, of which you speak, from kindergarten up to the 12th grades, not only in Washington,
We
D.C.,
destroy what Head
but
Start does,
just
don't
a moment. Unless you do that, then Head Start is false start rather than Head Start. That's what the Westinghouse report said, and that's what we've been arguing.
Sam, you had a comment to make?
No, I just want to say these approaches are not mutually exclusive. I think we've got to concentrate on education from the prenatal stage to the postgraduate stage.
Of course.
You know, you're not talking, you're talking by each other, not to each other.
Boogie?
If Head Start did nothing else but to demonstrate that in order to meet the problems of the black child, you've got to tackle every social problem, housing, employment for the parents, welfare services, everything else, so that I don't worry at all about this recent study. Now, I want to ask Julius this question.
Well, let's not only concentrate on George.
Because the word white racism has been used a lot. I ask you, Julius, if white racism is a total explanation, the only thing we ought to talk about, what is it you want to do about
No, white
that?
racism
in a country where 88% of the
but as
people
a
are
black
white.
man in the United States, I feel that I've been a victim of white oppression. There's no question about it. All the history documents demonstrate this.
I agree.
And I think that what we've got to do is deal with, if you've got your foot on my neck, it seems to me that I shouldn't deal with the question of how I can toughen my neck to take the weight. I should deal with the question of how I can get your foot off.
One way of doing
Now,
that
that's
is
the
by
point
improving
that
the
I'm
quality
trying
of
to make.
education. How are you going to remove that foot off the neck unless you're educated and knowledgeable
I'm in
in
favor of
economic
quality
skills?
education,
What
Jim.
interests
I've
me-
spent my
This is
entire
precisely
life
what we're
fighting for
saying.
quality education.
This is
There's
precisely
no question
what
about that.
I submit that
That's
you're
pretty
being inconsistent.
What interests me, however, is that we are referring to programs that have been enacted by the government.
Yes.
All of which leads me to say, aren't we then saying that we have a road, we're on the road, we're moving in a direction, but perhaps not moving fast enough?
Not only that, but we are not moving far enough. We have far too little funds, some $2 billion when we need $20 billion a year. There is not enough of a comprehensive program. We have seen aspects of it in isolation. And I submit that all aspects of this problem are so interrelated that unless we work at all of them simultaneously, the work we do on any one is bound to be of limited effectiveness.
I want to raise one question here before we finish this program, and that's the question that the word violence. We've used the word violence before. Do you think violence has any role, any members here of the panel, in the forward progress toward human rights? Or do you think that violence perhaps stands in the way of that progress?
Well, I think all we need to do to answer that is look at history, the history and development of this country. I mean, we read Indian,
I have found that
we developed out of a violent context.
Yeah.
I think violence is an inherent characteristic from the Indians to the nigger in this country, to the lynching. I think there's just no question about it, and that violence is definitely a part of our heritage,
Julius,
a part of our nature.
Except this, that there's a recent study on violence, which I think has been widely misinterpreted. That report demonstrates that violence is something, looking at history, we ought to avoid.
Indeed,
that violence
it is.
has been
I agree.
counterproductive.
I agree
But
with
too
you.
many, and I thought your first comment suggested that, well, since violence is as, what do they say, American as cherry pie, we ought to embrace it.
No, my first comment was to make it very plain that violence is an inherent characteristic of our development.
I think there's no question but that violence is a part of American culture.
Indeed.
There's been a very violent nature.
Well, but wouldn't you also say that American...
Racism is an intrinsic part of American culture.
And we're trying to change it.
We're trying to change it.
Of course.
So, I mean, the mere fact that violence is an integral part of American history, and it surely is, that doesn't justify it at all.
Well, also,
it seemed to me that
I want to point out one thing.
Yeah, it seemed to me that the problem is that Max raised is whether violence is an effective instrument of social change.
That's the question.
And
what's
frankly,
your judgment?
I don't think it is.
Well, I'd like to...
Please,
as a man who has spent some years working on violence. I wish that it were possible to say that violence never produces any good results. But that would simply not hold up intellectually. Look at Watts. Ask anybody in Watts and they will tell you that most people didn't know there was such a community as Watts. The police chief had never been there. The mayor didn't know that he had that part of a city. Now, since they exploded, the cruel fact of the matter is that it was that explosion that produced hundreds of millions of dollars of public funds into Watts.
But what kind of real changes have occurred in Watts?
Now, that's
What's
not
the
quite the
unemployment
issue.
rate there now?
Have been
What's the
some
gap
changes.
income now? Isn't Watts still isolated?
Not quite as much as it was isolated. There are many more.
Still segregated and so forth?
No, wait a minute. There have been many improvements. You look at the houses that have gone up in Watts, and this resulted from the violence that took place.
No,
Now,
I
wait a
deny
minute.
that. I deny that emphatically.
I don't think you can deny it.
Well, let him try, Jim. Let him try to deny it. Go ahead.
Well, because for one thing, I was in the poverty program during the Watts riot, and I saw that every time we had significant violence in this country, there was a backlash in the Congress and among people in this country, which made that violence counterproductive. The important thing is
You mean
how you
every
do
time we
it.
had black violence?
The important thing is how you, well, all
mean
right.
black violence.
Yes,
You don't mean white
Now,
violence.
excuse me, I want to take issue with this.
That argument.
You shouldn't agree that it's just black violence that's
Let's say now, it
counterproductive.
depends upon how you want to do your arithmetic. It can be argued, if I can risk an analogy, that because 60,000 people were killed on the roads, it forced us to do something more about safety.
Yes.
Would you argue that therefore it would have been better if 80,000?
I haven't suggested that violence is a good thing.
There are short-term, Jim, I would agree that there are sometimes short-run minor gains following some violence. But the reason I jumped on you, Jim, forgive me for doing that, is that I'm afraid that our viewers, our listeners might think that you are therefore advocating.
If you had only let me complete without jumping in.
Well, I think it's only fair.
I don't advocate violence, of course, but I do not say that violence has never accomplished anything that is good. I think that our nation must mature enough to be able to respond to the necessities of dealing with these problems without violence.
And prevent the violence.
Could I make just one observation here? I think it's very essential. I think it's very essential here that we come to the understanding of what we're talking about when we're talking about violence. There are two concepts of violence. Let me give you a quick example. I made a speech in which the word violence was used, and I was attacked in Congress, etc., and should have been tried for treason and so forth. There's a telephone in town that you can dial a number of where the people are advocating that everybody go get guns and kill niggers, and niggers being somebody that looks like me. Now, there were editorial after editorial about my speech in which it was just the word violence was used, but there is no editorial on the concept of this white proposal to kill black people. Well, so what I'm saying is we need to get together on the definition of violence. If you're talking about black people resisting, then that's what if that's the kind of violence you're talking about. But for me, Vietnam is violent. To me, lynching and murdering black people is violent. To me, rioting in the ghetto is violence. And I'm talking about all violence and just not black reaction to white.
Are you opposed to all violence?
I'm opposed to all violence.
Okay.
Right.
I'm opposed to all violence.
Are you opposed to all violence?
I'm opposed to violence as when it's aggressive. If you're defining self-defense as violence, I'm with you on that.
Yes.
But that's not what we were talking about.
Yes. The
I didn't
point.
say anything about self-defense.
Well,
That's
I
what
think.
you said defending themselves.
Sam, do you have a comment you want to make?
No.
No. Well, I want to say thank you to all of you. This was a very spirited discussion. We agreed at least on one thing, which is that none of us like violence. But I do think it's important to point out that violence is not just a concomitant of the American culture, but exists, unfortunately, still all over the world.
Sure.
And all of us who at least sit around this panel and discuss the issue of human rights in America, discuss it within a context of a democratic society, and look to the day when we'll reap the fruits of that society for all people, regardless of color.
That's the one good thing about our society. We can sit around and discuss it.
And we can talk about it.
Right away.
Thank you very much.
Tonight's panelists were Dr. Samuel Cook, professor of political science at Duke University and an outstanding American historian. Mr. Julius Hobson, economist, author, and activist in civil rights and educational reform movements in Washington, D.C. Mr. James Farmer, Assistant Secretary of the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, and founder of the Congress on Racial Equality. And Mr. Hyman Bookbinder, prominent member of the American Labor Movement and former Deputy Director of the U.S. Anti-Poverty Program. Your moderator has been lawyer, political scientist, Max Kampelman.